When Jake Hollister raised his hand to bid $20 on the limping mare, the crowd's laughter hit him like a fist to the gut. 6 months later, not a single person in Sweetwater County was laughing anymore. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Hollister stood at the edge of the auction pen with exactly $43 in his pocket, watching the glossy quarter horses parade past like debutantes at a ball he had no business attending. The morning sun beat down on the dusty fairgrounds outside Sweetwater, Texas, and the auctioneer's voice carried across the crowd with the practiced rhythm of a man who knew how to separate cowboys from their money. Jake had been that cowboy once, back when his daddy's ranch still stood, and his name meant something in these parts. That was before the drought, before the debts, before everything he'd built turned to dust and blew away on the merciless West Texas wind. The horses gleamed in the September light, their coats brushed to perfection, their muscles rippling with the kind of strength that came from good breeding and better feed. Jake watched a magnificent bay stallion sell for $1,200, more money than he'd seen in 6 months, and felt the familiar weight of failure settle onto his shoulders like an old saddle blanket. He had no business being here. $43 wouldn't buy him a halter, let alone a horse capable of the ranch work he desperately needed to secure. The Rockingham Ranch had posted a notice last week looking for hands willing to bring their own mounts for the fall roundup. 6 months of steady work, room and board, and enough pay to maybe, just maybe, get him back on his feet. But you needed a horse for that kind of work, and horses cost money he didn't have. Around him, ranchers in clean Stetsons and pressed shirts bid with casual confidence, their checkbooks ready, their reputations secure. Jake had known some of these men once, had shared beers and stories with them back when his last name still carried weight. Now they looked through him like he was a ghost, and maybe that's exactly what he was. The ghost of better days, haunting an auction he couldn't afford to attend. His truck, a rusted Ford older than most of the cowboys present, sat in the parking lot with a quarter tank of gas and a prayer that it would make it back to the boarding house where he'd been doing odd jobs for rent. His work boots had holes in the soles that he'd patched with cardboard, and his jeans were worn thin at the knees. He was 32 years old and felt ancient, weathered by loss in ways that had nothing to do with age. The auctioneer's voice shifted, taking on a different tone, slightly apologetic, almost dismissive. Now, folks, we've got a special case here. This mare came from the Henderson place, been laid up with an injury. She's got good bloodlines, proven working horse before the accident, but I'll be straight with you, she's got a significant limp in her right foreleg. Old injury that didn't heal quite right. She's sound enough for light work, maybe a trail horse or a companion animal, but she's not going to win you any ribbons or run down any cattle. Jake looked up as they led the mare into the pen, and his heart did something unexpected. It twisted with recognition, not of the horse herself, but of the look in her eyes. She was a sorrel with a white blaze down her face, probably 8 or 9 years old, her coat dull from lack of proper care, but it was the way she carried herself that caught his attention. Despite the pronounced limp, despite the way the other horses had pranced and preened, this mare held her head high. There was dignity in her bearing, a quiet pride that reminded him painfully of his own father, who had worked until the day he died, never complaining, never bowing to the hardships that eventually took everything from him. The bidding started at $50. Silence greeted the auctioneer's call. He dropped it to $35. Still nothing. The crowd had already moved on mentally to the next horse, dismissing this broken animal as unworthy of their attention. Jake felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in the long months since he'd lost the ranch. It might have been anger at the casual dismissal of something that still had value, or it might have been recognition of a kindred spirit, broken but not beaten. Whatever it was, it made him raise his hand, $20, he called out, his voice rough from disuse. Around him, heads turned. He heard the snickers before he saw the faces, ranchers and cowboys exchanging looks that mixed amusement with pity. Tom Brennan, who owned the spread adjacent to where Jake's family ranch used to be, actually laughed out loud. "Hollister, you planning to ride that cripple in the roundup? That'll be a sight to see. Maybe you can limp along together." The comment drew more laughter, and Jake felt his face flush with humiliation. But he kept his hand up, kept his eyes on the mare who was watching him now with what he could have sworn was understanding. The auctioneer, perhaps sensing an opportunity to move past an embarrassing moment, called out quickly, $20 going once, going twice. He paused, giving the crowd one last chance to save Jake from his foolishness. The silence was punctuated by more laughter, by whispered comments about how far the mighty had fallen. Someone behind him said, "Broke cowboy buys a broke horse. Perfect match." The words stung because they were true, but Jake didn't lower his hand. "Sold to the gentleman in the back for $20. The gavel came down, and with it any remaining shred of Jake's reputation in the ranching community. As he made his way to the payment window, he could feel eyes on him, could hear the laughter following him like a shadow. He handed over 20 of his precious $43, signed the papers with hands that shook slightly, and walked out to meet his new horse. She stood in the holding pen, separated now from the glossy animals that had sold for respectable prices, and when Jake approached with her lead rope, she didn't shy away. Instead, she took a careful step toward him, her limp pronounced but her eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like hope. "Well, girl," Jake said quietly, reaching out to stroke her soft muzzle. "Looks like we're both the joke of Sweetwater today. But maybe that's all right. Maybe we've got something to prove." The mare nickered softly, pressing her head against his chest in a gesture that felt like trust or maybe gratitude, or perhaps just recognition that they were now in this together, whatever this turned out to be. The boarding house where Jake had been staying for the past 3 months sat on the edge of Sweetwater, a weathered 2-story structure that had seen better days, much like everything else in his life. Mrs. Eleanor Raines, the widow who owned the place, had taken pity on him after he'd shown up with nothing but a duffel bag and honest eyes. She'd offered him a room in exchange for repairs, painting, and general handyman work. It wasn't charity, she'd insisted. She genuinely needed the help, and Jake was grateful for the fiction that allowed him to keep his pride intact, even if just barely. When he pulled up in his rattling Ford with the lame mare tied in the small trailer he'd borrowed from Mrs. Raines, he could see her standing on the porch, her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between concern and exasperation. Eleanor Raines was in her 60s, with steel-gray hair she wore in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been a rancher's wife for 40 years before cancer took her husband, and she knew the business better than most men who claimed expertise. She also knew foolishness when she saw it, and the look on her face suggested she was seeing plenty of it right now. "Jacob Hollister," she called out as he climbed from the truck, her voice carrying the particular tone that reminded him uncomfortably of his late mother. "Please tell me you did not spend your last dollars on that horse." Jake walked around to the trailer, unlatching the back gate with careful movements. The mare backed out slowly, her limp even more pronounced after the ride, and he saw Mrs. Raines's expression shift from exasperation to something softer, though she tried to hide it. She needed someone, he said simply, leading the mare toward the small paddock behind the boarding house where Mrs. Raines kept her old gelding, a retired ranch horse named Chester, who spent his days dozing in the shade. "And you needed a working horse for the Rockingham job, not a cripple who can barely walk," Mrs. Raines countered, but she was already moving down the porch steps, her practiced eye assessing the mare with the expertise of someone who'd evaluated hundreds of horses in her lifetime. She circled the animal slowly, and Jake watched her face, seeing the calculations happening behind those sharp eyes. Finally, she reached out and ran her hand down the mare's injured leg, feeling carefully along the bone and tendon. The mare stood quietly, patient under the examination, and Jake felt a surge of gratitude for her gentle temperament. "It's an old tendon injury," Mrs. Raines said finally, straightening up with a slight grimace that spoke to her own aging joints. "Probably wasn't treated right when it happened. There's scar tissue, but the bone seems sound. She's not lame in the sense of being completely unsound, Jake. She's just got limitations." She looked at him directly, and he saw something in her eyes that might have been approval or might have been pity. He couldn't quite tell. "What are you planning to do with her? You can't work cattle on a horse that can't keep up." Jake had been asking himself the same question since he'd raised his hand at the auction. What had possessed him to spend money he couldn't afford on a horse he couldn't use? But standing here in the late afternoon sun, watching the way the mare's ears swiveled toward him whenever he spoke, feeling the connection that had sparked between them at the auction pen, he found himself answering with more conviction than he'd felt about anything in months. "I'm going to heal her," he said. "Or at least try. And then maybe, just maybe, she'll be sound enough for the work we need to do." Mrs. Raines was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "You know that's a long shot, don't you? That injury's been there for months, maybe longer. Scar tissue doesn't just disappear because you want it to." Jake nodded, running his hand along the mare's neck, feeling the warmth of her beneath his palm. "Yes, ma'am, I know. But I also know what it feels like when everyone writes you off as finished, when they look at you and see nothing but damage and limitation. This horse has more to give. I can see it in her eyes. She's not done yet." The words hung in the air between them, and Jake knew they weren't really talking about the horse anymore. Mrs. Raines knew his story, knew about the ranch he'd lost, the debts that had crushed him, the slow spiral from respected rancher's son to broke handyman living on charity and odd jobs. She'd watched him work through the past months, had seen the way he approached every repair with meticulous care, as if by fixing her sagging porch or patching her roof, he could somehow repair the broken pieces of his own life. "All right then," she said finally, her voice softer than before. "You can keep her in the paddock with Chester. Lord knows that old horse could use the company, but Jake, that rocking M job starts in 2 weeks. If she's not sound enough by then, you're going to have to face reality. 2 weeks. 14 days to somehow rehabilitate a horse that others had given up on, to prove that his instincts weren't as broken as his bank account. It was impossible, probably, but Jake had learned something in the month since losing everything. When you hit rock bottom, impossible was just another word for something you hadn't figured out yet. He spent the rest of that day getting the mare settled, creating a comfortable space for her in the paddock, making sure she had clean water and good hay. Mrs. Raines had contributed feed from her own supplies, and though she hadn't said anything more about the horse, Jake had caught her watching through the kitchen window, her expression thoughtful. That evening, after finishing his work on Mrs. Raines's fence line, Jake sat on the paddock rail as the sun set, watching the mare move carefully around her new space. She investigated every corner, her curiosity evident despite her injury, and when she finally settled near the fence where Jake sat, he began talking to her in a low, steady voice. "I'm going to call you Phoenix," he said, the name coming to him as naturally as breathing, "because you're going to rise from these ashes just like I am. We're both going to prove them wrong." The mare's ear flicked toward him, and in the golden light of sunset, Jake could have sworn she understood every word. He pulled out his phone, the screen cracked but still functional, and searched for information about tendon injuries in horses. The articles he found were mostly discouraging, full of warnings about permanent damage and limited recovery potential. But scattered among the pessimism were stories of horses who had defied expectations, who had healed beyond what veterinarians thought possible through patient rehabilitation and careful management. Jake read every word, taking mental notes about gentle exercise, proper nutrition, massage techniques, and gradual conditioning. He had no money for expensive veterinary treatments, but he had time, determination, and a growing certainty that this horse represented something more than just transportation for a cattle job. As night fell over Sweetwater and the temperature dropped, Jake finally climbed down from the fence rail. Phoenix was standing near Chester now, the two horses touching noses in the gentle way animals had of welcoming newcomers to their space. The old gelding seemed to understand that this new companion needed kindness, and Jake felt something ease in his chest at the sight. "Good night, girl," he called softly. "Tomorrow we start the real work." As he walked back to the boarding house, he could still hear the laughter from the auction echoing in his memory. They had laughed at the broke cowboy choosing the lame horse, had dismissed them both as finished, as jokes, as cautionary tales. But Jake had been counted out before, and he'd learned that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage you could have. Let them laugh now. In 6 months they wouldn't be laughing anymore. The first morning with Phoenix began before dawn, as most meaningful things in Jake's life always had. He'd learned from his father that the early hours held a particular kind of magic, when the world was quiet and possibility felt infinite. He dressed in the dark, pulling on his worn jeans and patched boots, and made his way down to the paddock with a cup of coffee steaming in the cool September air. Phoenix was already awake, standing alert near the fence, and when she saw him approaching, she nickered softly, a sound that went straight to Jake's heart, like an arrow finding its mark. He spent an hour just observing her, watching how she moved, noting which movements caused her discomfort and which seemed to come naturally. The limp was most pronounced when she first started walking, improving slightly as she warmed up, which gave him hope that the injury was manageable rather than catastrophic. He'd read enough the night before to know that scar tissue could be stretched and softened with patient work, that muscles could be strengthened to compensate for weakness, that animals, like people, had remarkable capacity for healing when given the right conditions and enough time. After his observation, Jake entered the paddock with a soft brush he'd borrowed from Mrs. Raines's tack room. Phoenix stood quietly as he began grooming her, his strokes long and gentle, removing the dust and neglect that had accumulated during her time at the Henderson place. As he worked, he talked to her in that same low, steady voice he'd used the night before, telling her about his plans for their rehabilitation, about the Rockingham job that represented both their futures, about the ranch he'd lost, and the man he was trying to become again. The mare's eyes softened as he spoke, and several times she turned her head to nuzzle his shoulder, as if offering her own form of comfort. Mrs. Raines emerged from the house as the sun crested the horizon, 2 plates of breakfast in her hands. She'd made this a morning ritual since Jake had arrived, insisting that a working man needed a proper meal to start the day, and he'd long since stopped protesting, recognizing her generosity for what it was, kindness dressed up as practicality. They sat on the porch steps together, eating scrambled eggs and toast, while watching Phoenix explore her paddock in the strengthening light. "She's got good conformation apart from that leg," Mrs. Raines observed, her practiced eye assessing the mare's build. "Good bone structure, nice chest, strong hindquarters. Someone put quality breeding into her bloodline." Jake nodded, swallowing a bite of eggs. "Henderson mentioned her papers when I picked her up. She's registered, got a working bloodline going back 3 generations. Her dam was a champion cutting horse before she retired to breeding." The information made Phoenix's current state even more tragic. A horse bred for excellence reduced to an auction reject because of one injury that had been poorly managed. "What happened to her?" Mrs. Raines asked. Henderson said she caught her leg in some old wire fencing about 8 months ago, tore the tendon pretty bad. By the time they got a vet out there, infection had set in. They saved the leg, but the healing process wasn't supervised properly. She was turned out to pasture and basically forgotten until Henderson decided to liquidate his stock. The casual cruelty of it made Jake's jaw tighten. Phoenix hadn't asked to be injured, hadn't chosen to be neglected during her recovery. She'd simply been another asset that lost value and was therefore discarded, like equipment that broke down or land that stopped producing. It was a philosophy Jake had seen too often in the ranching world, a purely economic view of animals that ignored their capacity for feeling, for loyalty, for connection. His father had never operated that way, had always treated their horses with respect and care, and Jake had inherited that same conviction that animals deserved better than to be reduced to mere dollar signs in a ledger. After breakfast, Jake began the real work. He'd mapped out a rehabilitation plan based on his research, starting with gentle walking exercises to gradually stretch and strengthen Phoenix's injured tendon. He fashioned a lead rope from some cord Mrs. Raines had in her storage shed and began leading Phoenix around the paddock in slow, careful circles. At first the mare was hesitant, her limp pronounced and her movements stiff. But Jake was patient, stopping frequently to let her rest, encouraging her with soft words and gentle touches. By the end of the first hour, he noticed a subtle improvement in her gait, the limp still present but slightly less severe as her muscles warmed up. The work was slow, tedious, requiring a patience that Jake hadn't known he possessed until necessity taught it to him. They walked for 20 minutes, rested for 10, then walked again, building up her tolerance gradually. He paid careful attention to her breathing, to any signs of pain or distress, ready to stop immediately if she showed discomfort beyond the normal strain of rehabilitation. Phoenix seemed to understand what he was trying to do, cooperating in a way that suggested intelligence and willingness beyond what he'd expected. She trusted him, and that trust felt like both a gift and a responsibility he was determined not to betray. By midday, Jake had to stop the training session to attend to his work obligations. Mrs. Raines had a list of repairs that needed completing, and he couldn't neglect the responsibilities that were keeping a roof over his head. He spent the afternoon replacing rotted boards on the back porch, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions while his mind remained focused on Phoenix. Every time he glanced toward the paddock, he could see her standing near the fence, watching him work, and the connection between them seemed to strengthen with each passing hour. That evening, as Jake was finishing his repairs, a truck pulled into the driveway. Jake recognized it immediately, the gleaming Ford F-250 that belonged to Tom Brennan, the man who'd laughed loudest at the auction. Brennan climbed out, his boots polished, his shirt crisp despite the day's heat, everything about him screaming success and prosperity. He walked over to where Jake was collecting his tools, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "A Hollister," he said, his tone dripping with false friendliness. "Heard you're planning to ride that cripple in the Rocking M Roundup. That true?" Jake straightened, meeting Brennan's eyes directly. "That's the plan." Brennan laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You're even more desperate than I thought. That horse couldn't keep up with a trail ride, let alone 6 months of hard ranch work. You're going to make a fool of yourself." The words stung because they echoed Jake's own fears, the doubts that crept in during the quiet hours when hope seemed foolish and optimism felt like delusion. But Jake had learned something in the month since losing everything. Other people's certainty about your limitations said more about them than it did about you. "Maybe," Jake replied, his voice calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Or maybe you're wrong. Maybe that horse has more heart than any of the fancy animals you bid on. Maybe being counted out is exactly the motivation we both need." Brennan's smirk faded slightly, replaced by something that looked like genuine puzzlement. "Why are you doing this?" Why throw away your last chance at decent work on a horse that can't deliver? Jake looked past Brennan toward the paddock where Phoenix stood watching them, her ears forward, her eyes bright. Because everyone deserves a second chance, he said quietly. Even broke cowboys and lame horses. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment Brennan's expression shifted to something almost like respect before the mask of superiority slipped back into place. "Your funeral," he said, turning back toward his truck. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The days fell into a rhythm that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. Jake woke before dawn, worked with Phoenix for 2 hours, completed his repairs and maintenance for Mrs. Raines, then returned to the mare in the afternoon for another training session. Each day brought small improvements that would have been invisible to anyone not paying close attention, but Jake noticed everything. The way Phoenix's stride lengthened by a fraction of an inch, the way her limp became less pronounced after the first few minutes of walking, the way her eyes grew brighter and her coat began to shine as proper care and nutrition worked their subtle magic. On the 4th day, something remarkable happened. Jake was leading Phoenix through their morning walk when she suddenly quickened her pace, pulling slightly against the lead rope with an energy he hadn't seen before. For a moment, watching her move with something approaching eagerness, the limp seemed to almost disappear. It lasted only a few strides before she settled back into her careful, measured gait, but Jake had seen it. The glimpse of what she could become, what she might have been before the injury, what she could be again with time and patience. He stopped walking and pressed his forehead against her neck, feeling the warmth of her body, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and allowed himself to hope. Mrs. Raines had been watching from the porch, and when Jake looked up, he saw tears streaming down her weathered face. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed to be caught in a moment of sentiment, but she didn't look away. "Eleanor saw it too," she called out, using her first name in a way she rarely did. "That horse wants to run, Jake. She wants to be what she was meant to be." The validation from someone whose opinion he respected deeply meant more than Jake could express. He simply nodded, his own throat too tight for words, and continued the session with renewed determination. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who served the Sweetwater area, pulled up in her mobile clinic truck while Jake was working on repairing Mrs. Raines's garden shed. She was in her mid-30s, efficient and no-nonsense, with a reputation for being one of the best large animal vets in 3 counties. Jake had never been able to afford her services, even back when he'd had the ranch, preferring to handle most animal care himself and call the vet only for emergencies. Now, watching her climb out of her truck, he felt his stomach sink. He couldn't afford a vet bill, and if Dr. Chen was here to examine Phoenix, he'd have to turn her away no matter how much the mare might benefit from professional evaluation. But Dr. Chen wasn't looking at him with the expectation of payment. Instead, she walked directly to the paddock where Phoenix and Chester stood in companionable silence. "Mrs. Raines called me," she said without preamble. "Told me about the mare you bought at auction. Said you've been rehabilitating her yourself." Jake set down his tools and approached cautiously. "I can't afford to pay for an exam, Dr. Chen. I appreciate you coming out, but I should have been straight with Mrs. Raines about my financial situation." The vet waved away his concern. "This isn't a paid call, Mr. Hollister. I'm here because Eleanor Raines told me something I found interesting. She said you've gotten that mare moving better in 4 days than most people could manage in 4 weeks. I wanted to see for myself." Jake felt heat rise to his face, uncertain whether Mrs. Raines's assessment was accurate or simply the kind words of someone who wanted to encourage him. But he led Dr. Chen into the paddock and brought Phoenix out, watching as the vet conducted a thorough examination. Her hands were gentle but methodical as she felt along Phoenix's injured leg, tested her range of motion, and observed her gait from multiple angles. The exam took nearly 30 minutes, and Jake stood by anxiously, awaiting a verdict he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Finally, Doctor. Chen straightened up and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "The scar tissue is significant," she said, her tone clinical but not unkind. "The original injury was severe, and you're right that it wasn't managed properly during the healing phase, but here's what's remarkable. In the 4 days you've been working with her, you've already begun breaking down some of that scar tissue through gentle stretching and movement. Her muscle tone is improving, and more importantly, she's not favoring the leg as much as I would expect given the extent of the injury." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Mr. Hollister, I'm not going to promise you miracles. That leg will never be perfect. But with continued rehabilitation of the kind you've been doing, I believe this mare could become sound enough for moderate ranch work. Not competitive cutting or racing, but daily riding, light cattle work, the kind of steady labor that requires endurance rather than speed." The words hit Jake like a physical force, validation from an expert that his instincts hadn't been wrong, that the connection he felt with Phoenix was translating into real, measurable progress. "Are you serious?" he managed, his voice rough with emotion. Dr. Chen nodded. "I'm serious. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Gradual increase in exercise, careful attention to any signs of pain or inflammation, good nutrition, and patient conditioning. She's responding beautifully to your care." She pulled a card from her pocket and handed it to Jake. "If you run into any problems, call me. No charge for advice over the phone. And when you're back on your feet financially, we can settle up then. I believe in investing in people who care about their animals the way you clearly care about this one." After Dr. Chen left, Jake stood alone in the paddock with Phoenix, processing what had just happened. For the first time in months, someone with real expertise had looked at his situation and seen possibility instead of futility. The mare nuzzled his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her neck, allowing himself a moment of unguarded emotion. "We're going to do this, girl," he whispered. "We're going to prove them all wrong." The 2 weeks until the Rocking M job had seemed impossible when he'd started. Now, with Dr. Chen's assessment providing concrete hope, the deadline felt challenging but achievable. That evening, Jake sat on the porch with Mrs. Raines, watching the sun set over the Texas landscape. She'd made her special cornbread to celebrate Dr. Chen's positive evaluation, and they ate in comfortable silence, the kind that only develops between people who've learned to trust each other. "Thank you for calling her," Jake said finally. "I know it probably wasn't cheap to get her out here." Mrs. Raines waved her hand dismissively. "Sarah Chen and I go back years. Her father and my late husband were friends. She didn't charge me a cent, just wanted to see if the gossip about your horse training skills was true." She looked at him directly. "Turns out it is." Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of shame and failure that had lived there since losing the ranch. He wasn't just the broke cowboy who'd made a fool of himself at the auction anymore. He was someone who could see potential where others saw only damage, someone who had skills worth respecting, someone who was proving that second chances weren't just desperate fantasies, but real possibilities that could be built through patience and dedication. "I learned from the best," he said quietly, thinking of his father, who had always maintained that how you treated animals said everything about your character. "My daddy used to say that a good horseman doesn't force obedience, he earns partnership." Mrs. Raines nodded, her eyes distant with memories of her own. "Your father was a good man, Jake. He'd be proud of what you're doing here, not just with the horse, but with yourself. Losing everything doesn't define you. How you respond to that loss, that's what shows who you really are." The words settled into Jake's heart like seeds finding fertile soil. For so long he'd defined himself by what he'd lost, the ranch, the reputation, the future he'd planned. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way to understand his story. Not as a tale of failure, but as the beginning of something different, something he couldn't have built without first being broken down to his most essential elements. The 8th day brought rain, the kind of steady downpour that turned the paddock into a muddy mess and made outdoor work nearly impossible. Jake stood at the window of his small room in the boarding house, watching water stream down the glass, feeling frustration build in his chest like pressure in a kettle. Every day counted toward the 2-week deadline, and losing a day to weather felt like a setback he couldn't afford. But Mrs. Raines had other ideas. She appeared at his door mid-morning with a mug of hot coffee and a knowing look that suggested she'd anticipated his restlessness. "Rain days are for different kinds of work," she said, gesturing for him to follow her. She led him to a storage room he'd never been in before, filled with decades of accumulated ranch equipment. Saddles hung from the rafters, bridles draped over hooks, and in the corner, covered with a dusty tarp, sat something that made Jake's heart skip. Mrs. Raines pulled the tarp away to reveal a saddle that was clearly special, hand-tooled leather with intricate designs, perfectly maintained despite years of storage. "This was my husband's saddle," she said quietly, running her hand over the smooth leather. "Custom made by a craftsman in Santa Fe, fitted specifically to his measurements and riding style. He used it for 30 years, and when he died, I couldn't bring myself to sell it or use it. It's been sitting here for 5 years, waiting for the right horse and the right rider." Jake stared at the saddle, understanding the weight of what she was offering. This wasn't just equipment, it was a piece of her history, a tangible connection to the man she'd loved and lost. "Mrs. Raines, I can't accept this. It's too valuable, too personal." She turned to face him, her eyes fierce despite the tears gathering in their corners. "Michael would want it used, Jake. He'd want it on the back of a horse that someone believed in, ridden by a man who understood what it meant to fight for something worth having. That saddle deserves to be part of a second chance story, and so do you." Her words broke something open in Jake's chest, some last resistance he'd been holding on to. He accepted the saddle with hands that shook slightly, feeling the quality of the craftsmanship, the care that had been poured into every stitch and buckle. They spent the rainy afternoon cleaning and conditioning the saddle, working side by side in the warm storage room while rain drummed on the roof above them. Mrs. Raines shared stories about her husband, about the ranch they'd built together, about the losses that had eventually forced her to sell most of the land and retreat to this boarding house. Her story wasn't so different from Jake's, just separated by years and different circumstances. But the core was the same, the experience of watching everything you'd built slip away despite your best efforts, the humiliation of failure in a community that measured worth by success, the long struggle to find meaning after loss had stripped away your identity. "The hardest part wasn't losing the ranch," Mrs. Raines said as she worked oil into a leather strap. "It was losing the sense of who I was. I'd been a rancher's wife for 40 years. That was my identity, my purpose, my place in the world. When that was gone, I didn't know how to be Eleanor Raines anymore. I was just this empty shell going through motions." She looked at Jake directly. "That's why I called Dr. Chen. That's why I'm giving you this saddle. Because I see in you what I wish someone had seen in me sooner. You're not defined by what you lost, Jake. You're defined by what you choose to build next." The conversation stayed with Jake as the rain continued through the afternoon and into the evening. He thought about identity and purpose, about the difference between who he'd been and who he was becoming. The ranch he'd lost had been his father's dream, continued by Jake out of duty and love rather than genuine passion. He'd been a good rancher, competent and hardworking, but he'd never felt the calling his father had, the deep connection to the land and the lifestyle that made ranching more than just a job. Maybe losing everything hadn't been pure tragedy. Maybe it had been an opportunity he hadn't recognized, a chance to discover what he actually wanted rather than what he'd inherited. The rain stopped just before midnight, and Jake couldn't sleep. He pulled on his jacket and walked down to the paddock where Phoenix stood in the shelter of the three-sided barn, dry and comfortable. She nickered when she saw him, and he climbed over the fence to stand beside her, breathing in the smell of horse and hay and rain-washed air. "I don't know if I even want to be a rancher anymore, girl," he admitted quietly, the words feeling dangerous and liberating all at once. "Maybe I want something different. Maybe I want to do what I've been doing with you, working with horses that others have given up on, showing people what's possible when you believe in potential instead of just seeing problems." The idea took shape as he spoke it aloud, crystallizing into something that felt right in a way ranch management never had. He'd always been good with horses, patient and intuitive in ways his father had recognized and encouraged. What if that wasn't just a useful skill for ranch work, but a calling in itself? What if the Rockingham job wasn't his ultimate destination, but just a stepping stone toward something more meaningful? Phoenix leaned into him, and Jake wrapped his arm around her neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing. "We're both figuring out who we're supposed to be," he said. "That's okay. We've got time." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the rain having washed the world clean. Jake was up before sunrise, energized by the clarity that had come in the dark hours of the previous night. He brought out the saddle Mrs. Raines had given him and spent an hour introducing it to Phoenix, letting her smell it, draping it gently over her back, getting her accustomed to its weight and presence. She stood quietly through the process, trusting him completely, and Jake felt gratitude wash over him for this animal who had given him so much more than he'd expected when he bid $20 at that auction. They were halfway through their morning training session when another truck pulled into the driveway. This time it was Ray Morrison, the foreman from the Rockingham Ranch, and Jake's stomach clenched with sudden anxiety. The job didn't start for another 6 days. Why was Morrison here now? The foreman climbed out of his truck, a weathered man in his 50s with eyes that had seen everything the ranching life could throw at you. He walked directly to the paddock, leaned against the fence, and watched Jake work with Phoenix for several minutes before speaking. "Tom Brennan's been talking all over town about your lame horse," Morrison said finally, his tone neutral. "Says you're planning to show up at the Rockingham on an animal that can't do the work. Says I should save myself the trouble and tell you not to bother coming." Jake's heart sank, but he kept his face composed, kept working with Phoenix as if the foreman's words hadn't just threatened to destroy his last hope. "And what do you say, Mr. Morrison?" The foreman was quiet for another long moment, his eyes tracking Phoenix's movement. "I say that Mare's got better action than half the horses I saw at that auction. I say whatever you're doing with her is working. And I say Tom Brennan's been a blowhard since we were kids. And I stopped listening to him about 30 years ago." Jake stopped walking, turning to face Morrison fully, afraid to believe what he was hearing. The foreman's expression was serious but not unkind. "You show up at the Rockingham in 6 days with that horse moving the way she's moving now, and you've got a job, Hollister. Don't care what anyone else says. I judge horses by what they can do, not by what people think they can't." He tipped his hat and walked back to his truck, leaving Jake standing in the middle of the paddock with hope flooding through him like sunshine after rain. With Morrison's validation fueling his determination, Jake intensified Phoenix's training regimen. The mare was responding so well that he felt confident pushing her slightly harder, extending their walking sessions and beginning to introduce more varied terrain. He led her over ground that required her to adjust her balance and engage different muscle groups, carefully watching for any signs of pain or excessive strain. Phoenix rose to every challenge he presented, her intelligence and willingness evident in the way she approached each new task with focused attention rather than resistance. On the 10th day, Jake saddled her for the first time with Mrs. Raines's beautiful custom saddle. His hands were steady as he tightened the cinch, but his heart pounded with anticipation and anxiety. This was a crucial test. A horse could walk sound, but fail completely under the weight and pressure of a rider. If Phoenix couldn't carry him comfortably, all their progress would be meaningless for the ranch work ahead. He took his time, making sure every strap was properly adjusted, speaking to her in that low, calm voice that had become their private language. Phoenix stood perfectly still through the saddling process, though her ears swiveled constantly, tracking Jake's movements with alert interest. When he finally placed his foot in the stirrup, he paused, giving her one last chance to object or show nervousness. She simply turned her head to look at him, her dark eyes calm and trusting, and Jake felt something in his chest expand with emotion he couldn't quite name. He swung into the saddle with a smooth motion, settling his weight carefully, ready to dismount immediately if she showed any distress. For a moment they stood perfectly still together, Jake hardly breathing as he waited for her reaction. Then Phoenix took a step forward, then another, and Jake felt tears spring to his eyes as he realized her gait was smooth, controlled, and nearly even. The limp was still there, a slight hitch that would probably always be part of her movement, but it wasn't impeding her ability to carry him. She moved with confidence, with grace, with the bearing of a working horse who understood her purpose and was ready to fulfill it. They walked circles around the paddock for 20 minutes, Jake keeping the session short to avoid overtaxing her, but long enough to confirm what he could hardly believe. Phoenix could carry a rider, she could do the work. They had defied the odds and the doubters and the limitations that everyone else had seen as insurmountable. When he finally dismounted, his legs were shaking, and his face was wet with tears he made no effort to hide. He pressed his forehead against Phoenix's neck and whispered, "Thank you, girl. Thank you for believing we could do this." Mrs. Raines had watched the entire session from the porch, and when Jake looked up, he saw she was crying too. She came down to the paddock with a carrot she'd brought from the kitchen, feeding it to Phoenix with gentle hands, while studying the mare with the expert eye of someone who'd lived with horses her entire life. "She's sound, Jake," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not perfect, never going to be perfect, but sound enough for what you need. More than sound enough." She looked at him directly. "You did this. You saw what no one else could see, and you made it real through patience and faith and sheer stubborn determination." The praise meant more coming from her than it would have from anyone else. Mrs. Raines didn't offer empty compliments or false encouragement. If she said Phoenix was sound enough, then it was true. Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd been carrying since the auction, the burden of wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake, if his instincts had betrayed him, if he'd wasted his last chance on a foolish gamble. He hadn't been wrong. Phoenix had been exactly what he'd sensed she was, a diamond covered in dust, waiting for someone to see her true value. Word of Phoenix's progress spread through Sweetwater with the mysterious speed that characterized small-town gossip. By that afternoon, Jake had received 3 phone calls from people he barely knew, all wanting to see the lame horse that was somehow no longer lame. He deflected the requests politely but firmly, unwilling to turn Phoenix into a spectacle or subject her to the scrutiny of people who'd written her off. But he couldn't stop people from driving by slowly, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the mare that had become the talk of the town. On the 11th day, something unexpected happened. A young woman appeared at the boarding house, driving a battered pickup even older than Jake's. She was maybe 25, with sun-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that showed she knew her way around hard work. She introduced herself as Katie Henderson, and Jake recognized the last name immediately. Her family owned the ranch where Phoenix had been neglected after her injury. Katie's eyes were red-rimmed and her voice shook slightly as she spoke. "I heard what you did with Phoenix," she said, struggling to maintain composure. I heard you got her sound again, or mostly sound. I needed to see for myself. Jake studied her carefully, trying to gauge her intentions. Was she here to reclaim the horse, to cause trouble? But what he saw in her face was guilt and regret, rather than antagonism. He gestured toward the paddock where Phoenix was grazing peacefully. See for yourself. Katie approached the fence slowly, and Phoenix lifted her head, recognition flickering in her eyes. The mare walked toward the young woman without hesitation, and Katie's composure finally cracked. She sobbed openly as Phoenix nuzzled her shoulder. I tried to get Dad to treat her properly after the injury, Katie said through her tears. I begged him to call the vet back for follow-up care, to give her proper rehabilitation. But he said she was done, that it wasn't worth spending more money on a horse that would never be valuable again. I was away at college when he decided to auction her off. I didn't even know until after it happened. She looked at Jake with eyes full of pain. I loved this horse. She was mine before the injury. I trained her, competed with her, spent every day with her, and then I left for school. And when I came back, she was gone. Jake felt his anger at the Henderson family's neglect soften slightly. This wasn't the whole family's fault, just a father who saw animals as economic units rather than living beings with intrinsic worth. She's doing well now, he said gently. Better than well. In a few days, she'll start work at the Rockingham Ranch. Katie wiped her tears away, her expression shifting to something like hope mixed with resignation. I can't buy her back. I don't have the money, and even if I did, Dad would never allow more horses on our property. But I needed to see her, to know she was okay, to tell her I'm sorry for abandoning her. She spent an hour with Phoenix, grooming her with brushes she'd brought, talking to her in soft tones, saying goodbye in a way she'd never gotten the chance to do before. Jake watched from a respectful distance, understanding that this closure was important for both the young woman and the horse. When Katie finally prepared to leave, she turned to Jake with an expression of profound gratitude. Thank you for seeing what my father couldn't see. Thank you for giving her the second chance she deserved. She was always special, always had more heart than any horse I've ever known. I'm glad she found someone who recognized that. After Katie left, Jake stood alone with Phoenix, processing the encounter. The mare's story was more complex than he'd realized, marked not just by neglect, but by love and loss and broken connections. She'd been someone's treasured companion before injury and circumstance had reduced her to an auction reject. In some ways, her journey paralleled his own. Both of them had been valued once, had lost everything through circumstances beyond their control, had been written off by people who should have known better. And both of them were fighting their way back to relevance and purpose through nothing more than stubborn refusal to accept others' limitations. That evening, as Jake brushed Phoenix's coat until it gleamed in the fading light, he realized how much had changed in less than 2 weeks. He'd started this journey as a broke cowboy, making a desperate gamble on a lame horse. Now he was something different, a horseman who'd proven his instincts were sound, a man who'd rediscovered skills and purpose he'd forgotten he possessed. Phoenix had given him far more than transportation for a ranch job. She'd given him back his sense of self-worth, his confidence, his belief that he had something valuable to offer the world. The final days before the Rockingham job began took on an almost dreamlike quality. Jake worked with Phoenix morning and afternoon, gradually increasing the duration and intensity of their riding sessions. He introduced her to basic ranch work, practicing the stops and turns and sudden directional changes that would be required during cattle drives. She responded with an eagerness that suggested muscle memory from her previous life as Katie's competition horse, movements that injury had interrupted but not erased. Each day brought new confirmation that Phoenix was not just sound enough for ranch work, but genuinely good at it. On the 13th day, Jake made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. He needed to test Phoenix in real working conditions before showing up at the Rockingham, needed to know she could handle actual cattle and the unpredictability of ranch situations. He approached Mrs. Raines that morning with a request that had been forming in his mind for days. Her small property included a handful of cattle, remnants of the larger herd she'd maintained when her husband was alive. Would she allow him to work those cattle with Phoenix to put the mare through a genuine test before the job began? Mrs. Raines studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "Those cattle are half wild, Jake. I haven't worked them properly in years. They're ornery and unpredictable, which I suppose makes them perfect for testing your horse." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "But if that mare gets hurt because I let you do something foolish, I'll never forgive myself. Or you." Jake understood the concern behind her words. They'd come so far, and one accident could undo all their progress. But he also knew that walking into the Rockingham job without any real-world testing would be setting themselves up for failure or injury under even more demanding circumstances. They spent the morning setting up a makeshift arena using portable panels Mrs. Raines had stored in her barn. The work was hard and hot, but Jake welcomed it, channeling his nervous energy into productive action. By midday, they had created a space large enough to work a few cattle safely. Mrs. Raines made sandwiches while Jake saddled Phoenix, and they ate together in the shade of the porch, neither one speaking much, both understanding the significance of what was about to happen. This was Phoenix's final exam, the test that would determine whether Jake's instincts and all their hard work had truly prepared them for the challenge ahead. Mrs. Raines helped him move 3 of her most stubborn cattle into the arena, and Jake could immediately see what she'd meant about them being half wild. They were nervous and aggressive, looking for any opportunity to break away or cause trouble. He mounted Phoenix, feeling her tense slightly beneath him as she registered the cattle's presence. For a moment, he worried that the challenge might be too much, that he'd pushed too hard too fast. But then Phoenix's ears came forward with focused attention, and he felt her body language shift from uncertainty to readiness. She remembered this. Her body remembered what her mind might have forgotten during the months of injury and neglect. What happened next was something close to magic. Phoenix moved with a fluid grace that belied her injury, anticipating the cattle's movements with the intuition that marked truly exceptional cutting horses. When a cow tried to break left, Phoenix was already there, blocking the escape with precise positioning. When another charged forward looking for an opening, the mare held her ground with calm authority that made the animal think twice and retreat. Jake barely had to guide her, his hands light on the reins, his legs giving the subtlest of cues. Phoenix was doing what she'd been bred to do, what injury had stolen from her, what patient rehabilitation had restored. They worked the cattle for 30 minutes, and by the end, Jake was laughing with pure joy. Phoenix was breathing hard but not labored, her limp slightly more pronounced from the exertion, but nothing that suggested pain or damage. She'd passed the test with flying colors, proving beyond any doubt that she was capable of ranch work. Mrs. Raines was standing at the fence, her face glowing with an expression of triumph and validation. When Jake dismounted, she met him at the gate with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "That was remarkable," she said, her voice catching with emotion. "Jake, that horse is gifted. What you've done here, it's more than just rehabilitation. You've helped her become what she was always meant to be." Jake couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He simply nodded and led Phoenix to the water trough, letting her drink deeply while he processed what had just happened. They'd done it. Against all odds and everyone's expectations, they'd taken a lame auction reject and transformed her into a working horse, capable of competing with animals that had cost 10 times as much. That evening brought another visitor, but this time it was someone Jake had been hoping to see. Dr. Chen pulled up in her mobile clinic, and Jake felt a flutter of anxiety despite knowing Phoenix had performed beautifully. The vet had asked him to call when he was ready for a final evaluation before starting the ranch job, and Mrs. Raines had taken it upon herself to invite Dr. Chen to witness the cattle work. The vet had watched the entire session from her truck, Jake realized, observing without interfering, forming her professional assessment while they worked. Dr. Chen's examination was thorough and methodical, even more detailed than her first visit. She palpated every inch of Phoenix's injured leg, checked her vital signs, observed her movement from multiple angles, and asked Jake detailed questions about the mare's performance and any signs of discomfort he'd noticed. The exams seemed to take forever, and Jake stood by with mounting tension, waiting for a verdict that would either validate everything they'd accomplished or reveal some hidden problem that would shatter his hopes. Finally, Dr. Chen straightened up and turned to face him, her expression professional but warm. "Mr. Hollister, I'm going to be honest with you. When Eleanor first told me about what you were trying to do, I was skeptical. I've seen hundreds of tendon injuries in my career, and the ones that aren't managed properly during the initial healing phase rarely respond well to later rehabilitation. I came out here the first time more out of curiosity and respect for Eleanor than genuine belief that you could achieve significant improvement." She paused, and Jake braced himself for a qualification, a warning, some limitation that would diminish their success. But Dr. Chen was smiling now, her professional reserve giving way to genuine enthusiasm. "I was wrong. What you've accomplished here borders on miraculous. That mare is sound for ranch work. Not just barely adequate, but genuinely capable. Her muscle development is excellent. The scar tissue has been managed better than I would have thought possible without professional intervention, and her attitude and willingness to work are outstanding. You have a gift, Mr. Hollister, not just with this horse, but with animal rehabilitation in general. You should seriously consider making it more than just a personal project." The words echoed what Jake had been thinking since his late-night conversation with Phoenix after the rainstorm. This wasn't just about getting a job at the Rocking M. This was about discovering a calling, a purpose that went beyond economic necessity into something meaningful and lasting. He looked at Phoenix, standing quietly beside him, her eyes bright and alert, her body radiating health and contentment. Despite the challenging work she'd just completed, she'd saved him just as much as he'd saved her, giving him back not just hope, but direction. Dr. Chen handed him a folder of documents. "I've written up a full evaluation and certification that Phoenix is sound for ranch work. You'll want to show this to Ray Morrison when you report for the job. I've also included my contact information and a standing offer to consult on any other rehabilitation cases you might take on in the future. No charge for the evaluation, Jake. Consider it an investment in someone whose work I believe in." She shook his hand firmly, her grip strong and sure, then climbed back into her truck and drove away, leaving Jake standing in the fading light with documentation that proved what everyone had said was impossible. The morning Jake was scheduled to report to the Rocking M Ranch, he woke while stars still scattered the dark sky. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with anticipation and anxiety about the day ahead. This was it, the moment when everything they'd worked for would either prove itself or collapse under the weight of real-world demands. He dressed carefully in his cleanest work clothes, the fabric worn but mended with care, and made his way down to the paddock where Phoenix waited, already alert and watching for him as if she understood the significance of this day. Mrs. Raines was up too, despite the early hour. She'd prepared a substantial breakfast and packed him a lunch with enough food for 2 days, her way of showing support without speaking the emotions that might make them both cry. They ate together, in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who've been through something difficult together and come out stronger on the other side. When it was time to leave, she handed him an envelope with his name written in careful script. "Don't open it now," she said, her voice firm despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Read it tonight after your first day." Whatever happens out there, Jake, remember that you've already proven yourself where it matters most. The drive to the rocking M took 40 minutes. Phoenix loaded carefully in the borrowed trailer, Jake's hands steady on the wheel despite the butterflies doing acrobatics in his stomach. The ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of prime Texas rangeland, the kind of operation that employed dozens of cowboys and ran cattle by the thousands. As he pulled through the main gate, Jake felt simultaneously small and determined. He'd worked places like this before, back when he'd had his own ranch and hired himself out for extra income during busy seasons. But he'd arrived then as a respected peer, the son of a successful rancher. Now he was arriving as the broke cowboy who'd bought a lame horse, and everyone here knew it. Ray Morrison was waiting at the barn when Jake pulled up, along with a dozen other cowboys who were preparing their horses for the day's work. Jake recognized some faces from around Sweetwater, saw the nudges and whispered comments as he climbed out of his truck and moved to unload Phoenix. The mare backed out of the trailer with careful dignity, her head high despite the limp that was still visible if you knew to look for it. Jake heard someone laugh, heard a voice say something about bringing a three-legged dog to a wolf hunt, felt the familiar burn of humiliation in his chest, but he kept his face neutral, kept his movements calm and professional, and led Phoenix toward where Morrison stood observing everything with sharp eyes. "Hollister," the foreman acknowledged, his tone giving nothing away. "Let's see your paperwork." Jake handed over Dr. Chen's evaluation and certification, watching Morrison's face as the man read through the detailed medical assessment. Around them, the other cowboys had gone quiet, curious about what the foreman would say, hoping perhaps for entertainment in the form of Jake being turned away before he'd even started. Morrison finished reading, folded the papers carefully, and handed them back. "Says here your mare is certified sound for ranch work by Dr. Sarah Chen, who I respect more than just about any vet in Texas. That's good enough for me." The foreman's acceptance sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled cowboys. Morrison turned to address the group, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned his position through years of competent leadership. "This is Jake Hollister. He'll be working the fall roundup with us. Some of you might have opinions about his horse, and I don't care to hear them. You'll judge each other by the work you do, not by gossip or assumptions. Clear?" There were murmurs of acknowledgement, some reluctant, some more genuine. Tom Brennan was there, Jake noticed, mounted on an expensive paint horse, his expression sour as he watched the exchange. The first day's work involved moving a large herd from summer pasture to lower ground, preparing for the seasonal rotation that would continue through fall. It was exactly the kind of demanding, unpredictable work that tested both horse and rider. Jake saddled Phoenix with steady hands, aware of every eye on them, every cowboy watching to see if the lame horse would fail at the first real challenge. He mounted smoothly, feeling Phoenix's muscles coil beneath him with readiness rather than nervousness. She knew what was coming, had been preparing for exactly this kind of work through all their training sessions. The herd was restless and scattered, requiring constant attention to keep animals from breaking away and heading in wrong directions. Jake and Phoenix fell into the rhythm of the work as naturally as breathing. She moved with precision and confidence, her cutting horse instincts sharp despite the months of injury and recovery. When a stubborn steer tried to break from the group, Phoenix was on him instantly, her body language communicating authority that made the animal reconsider and rejoin the herd. When the terrain turned rough, requiring careful navigation through rocky passages, she picked her way with sure-footed intelligence that kept Jake safe and allowed him to focus on the cattle rather than worrying about his mount. By midday, something had shifted in the atmosphere among the cowboys. Jake noticed it in the way they stopped making jokes about Phoenix, in the way their expressions changed from mockery to grudging respect as they watched her work. She wasn't just keeping up, she was excelling, often anticipating cattle movements before the more experienced horses registered the threat. Her limp was barely noticeable during work, the adrenaline and focus seeming to minimize whatever discomfort the injury might cause. Jake felt pride surge through him every time she made a particularly skilled move, every time she proved that their hard work and belief had been justified. It was Tom Brennan who finally broke the silence that had settled over the lunch break. The Cowboys had gathered under a stand of cottonwoods, eating quickly before returning to the afternoon's work, and Brennan approached Jake with an expression that was hard to read. "That mare of yours," he said, his voice lacking its usual mocking tone. "She's better than I expected, than anyone expected." It wasn't quite an apology, but coming from Brennan, it was as close as Jake was likely to get. He nodded acknowledgement, not trusting himself to speak past the emotion building in his throat. Another cowboy, a young man Jake didn't know, spoke up from where he was checking his horse's hooves. "Where'd you learn to work with horses like that?" "I've been ranching my whole life, and I've never seen anyone rehabilitate a tendon injury that well." The question opened a floodgate. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know details about Phoenix's training, about the techniques Jake had used, about how long the rehabilitation had taken. He answered their questions honestly, describing the patient daily work, the gradual progression of exercises, the importance of reading the horse's signals, and never pushing beyond what she could handle safely. Ray Morrison had been listening from the edge of the group, and when the questions finally died down, he caught Jake's eye. "After we finish today's gather, I want to talk to you about something. There's more work here than just the fall roundup, if you're interested." Jake's heart skipped at the implication. Morrison was hinting at something beyond the temporary position Jake had signed up for, something more permanent and more significant. He managed a calm nod, though inside he was reeling with the possibility that this day might represent not just validation, but opportunity. The afternoon's work was even more demanding than the morning's had been. They pushed the herd through difficult terrain, dealt with several animals that decided to test everyone's patience, and worked straight through until sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. By the time they brought the cattle into their designated pasture and secured them for the night, every man and horse was exhausted. But it was the good kind of tired, the satisfaction that came from hard work, completed successfully. Jake dismounted and ran his hands over Phoenix's legs, checking for any heat or swelling that might indicate she'd been pushed too hard. She was sound, her breathing normal, her eyes bright despite the long day. Morrison approached as Jake was cooling Phoenix down. The foreman's face was difficult to read in the fading light, but his posture suggested satisfaction rather than concern. "That mare did good work today, Hollister. Real good work. Better than some horses I've seen that cost 20 times what you paid." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The Rocking M has been looking for someone to manage our horse breeding and rehabilitation program. Previous manager retired last month, and we haven't found the right replacement. Position includes housing, steady salary, full benefits, and the opportunity to work with some of the finest horse bloodlines in Texas. Interested?" Jake stared at Morrison, certain he'd misheard. A permanent position, management level, with benefits and housing. It was more than he'd dared hope for when he'd shown up that morning just grateful to have temporary work. "Yes, sir," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "Very interested." Morrison nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "We'll discuss details tomorrow. For now, get that mare settled and get some rest. You've earned it." As the foreman walked away, Jake stood alone with Phoenix in the gathering darkness, processing what had just happened. They'd done it. They'd gone from being the joke of Sweetwater to earning respect and opportunity through nothing more than hard work and refusal to accept others' limitations. That night, Jake settled Phoenix in the comfortable stable the Rocking M provided for their working horses. The facility was impressive, clean, and well-maintained with spacious stalls and quality feed. Phoenix seemed to understand she'd found something special. nickering contentedly as Jake brushed her down and checked her legs one final time. The day's hard work had left no damage, no swelling, no indication that she'd been pushed beyond her capabilities. She was tired but satisfied, and when Jake left her with fresh hay and water, she was already dozing, one hip cocked in the relaxed posture of a horse completely at ease. The bunkhouse assigned to temporary workers was basic but comfortable, and Jake was grateful to have a room to himself, a small mercy that allowed him privacy to process everything that had happened. He sat on the narrow bed, still wearing his work clothes, the smell of horse and sweat and prairie dust clinging to him like a second skin. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline and emotion finally catching up now that the day's demands had been met. He'd proven himself in Phoenix beyond any reasonable doubt. They'd faced skepticism and mockery and overcome it through nothing more than the work itself. And now, impossibly, he had an opportunity that exceeded anything he'd imagined when he raised his hand at that auction 2 weeks ago. He remembered Mrs. Raines's envelope then, still tucked in his jacket pocket. He retrieved it with careful hands, noting the slight tremor in his fingers as he opened the seal. Her handwriting was elegant despite her age, the script flowing across quality paper in lines that spoke of education and refinement. He began to read, and within the first sentence, tears were streaming down his face. "Dear Jake," the letter began, "by the time you read this, you will have completed your first day at the Rocking M, and I pray it went well. But whether it did or didn't, I need you to understand something important. You have already succeeded in the ways that matter most. When you arrived at my boarding house 3 months ago, you were broken in spirit if not in body. You'd lost everything except your integrity and your willingness to work hard, and those 2 things alone made you wealthy in ways most men never achieve. But you didn't believe in your own worth anymore. I could see it in your eyes, in the way you apologized for taking up space, in the way you seemed to think you deserved the hardship life had handed you." Jake had to stop reading, the words cutting too close to truths he'd tried to ignore. She'd seen through him so completely, had understood the self-doubt and shame he'd carried like physical weight. He took a shaky breath and continued. "Then you bought that horse and something changed, and you gave Phoenix a second chance, but more importantly, you gave yourself one too. Every morning when you worked with her, you were rebuilding more than just her strength and soundness. You were rebuilding yourself. Every time you chose patience over frustration, persistence over giving up, belief over doubt. You were becoming the man I always saw in you, the man your father raised you to be. The horse was the vehicle, Jake, but the real transformation was always in you." The words hit him with the force of revelation. He'd thought he was saving Phoenix, rehabilitating a damaged animal and proving others wrong. But Mrs. Raines was right. The mare had been his redemption, his path back to believing in himself. Every small victory with Phoenix had been rebuilding his shattered confidence. Every incremental improvement had been teaching him that failure wasn't permanent, that loss didn't define him unless he allowed it to. He'd been so focused on Phoenix's physical healing that he'd missed his own emotional and spiritual rehabilitation happening in parallel. Mrs. Raines's letter continued. "Whatever happens at the Rocking M, whether they see your worth or remain blind to it, please know that you have already proven everything you needed to prove. You are not the broke cowboy who bought a lame horse. You are a gifted horseman who saw potential where others saw only problems. You are a man of character who chose compassion over cynicism. You are someone I am proud to know and privileged to have helped in my small way. The saddle I gave you belonged to a man who believed that how you treat the vulnerable says everything about who you are. You've honored his memory and his philosophy through your care of Phoenix. He would have been proud to see his saddle on that mare's back, carrying a rider worthy of both." Jake couldn't see the words anymore through his tears. He folded the letter carefully and pressed it against his chest, feeling the weight of her faith in him. The gift of being truly seen and valued not for what he owned or achieved, but for who he chose to be when everything else was stripped away. This woman, this near stranger who'd taken him in when he had nothing, had given him more than shelter and work. She'd given him the space and support to find himself again, to discover that his worth wasn't tied to his bank account, or his property ownership, or his social standing. It was intrinsic, unchangeable, and had been there all along, waiting for him to recognize it. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the drought that destroyed his crops, the mounting debts that had forced him to sell the ranch piece by piece until nothing remained, the final humiliation of losing his father's land to the bank. At the time, each loss had felt like proof of his inadequacy, evidence that he wasn't the man his father had been, that he'd failed at the most fundamental level. But maybe Mrs. Raines was right. Maybe losing everything material had been necessary to discover what actually mattered. His father had been a successful rancher, but more importantly, he'd been a good man who treated animals with respect and people with dignity. That legacy wasn't tied to land ownership. It was tied to character, and Jake had inherited that even if he'd temporarily forgotten it. The knock on his door startled him from his reflections. He wiped his face quickly and opened it to find Ray Morrison standing in the corridor, hat in hand. "Sorry to bother you so late," the foreman said, "but I wanted to discuss the job offer while it was fresh." "Mind if I come in?" Jake stepped aside, suddenly conscious of his tear-stained face and rumpled appearance. But Morrison didn't seem to notice or care. He settled into the room's single chair while Jake sat back on the bed, and the foreman's expression was serious but kind. "I've been managing horses and cowboys for 30 years, Morrison began. "And I've learned to recognize the difference between someone who's good with animals and someone who has a genuine gift. What you did with that mare, that's not just skill, Hollister. That's intuition and empathy and patience working together in ways most people never achieve. The Rockingham needs someone like you overseeing our breeding program and rehabilitation efforts. We've got some valuable horses that need the kind of attention you gave Phoenix, and we've got young stock that would benefit from your training methods." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze direct. "The job comes with a house, 3-bedroom place about a mile from the main ranch buildings. Private but close enough to stay connected to operations. Salary's $45,000 a year to start, with annual reviews and raises based on performance. Full health benefits, retirement contribution, and you'd have autonomy over the horse program within reasonable budget constraints. You'd report directly to me, and I don't micromanage people who know their business. I give you the resources and trust you to make good decisions. Interested in making it official?" Jake looked at this man who'd given him a chance when others had laughed, who judged him by his work rather than his circumstances, who was now offering him not just a job, but a future. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning in his chest. "More than interested. Honored and grateful." Morrison stood and extended his hand. They shook firmly, sealing an agreement that represented so much more than employment. It was validation, opportunity, and the chance to build something meaningful from the ashes of what he'd lost. 6 months later, Jake stood in the center ring at the Sweetwater County Fair, Phoenix beneath him, as they demonstrated rehabilitation techniques to a crowd of ranchers and horse owners who'd paid good money to attend his workshop. The irony wasn't lost on him that this was the same fairground where the auction had taken place, where everyone had laughed at the broke cowboy buying a lame horse. Now those same people sat in bleachers taking notes, asking questions, treating him as an authority worth listening to. Phoenix moved through the demonstration with calm confidence, showing off the cutting skills that had been restored through patient work, her slight limp now barely noticeable and not impeding her performance in any way. The transformation of the past 6 months had exceeded even Jake's most optimistic hopes. The Rockingham's horse rehabilitation program had flourished under his management, with 4 previously unsound horses now back to full work, and 3 young prospects developing into exceptional animals under his training methods. Word had spread through the ranching community, and Jake found himself fielding calls from across Texas and beyond from people who'd heard about the miracle worker who could fix horses others had given up on. The consulting work supplemented his salary nicely, but more importantly, it validated what he'd discovered that rainy day talking with Mrs. Raines. This was his calling, not ranch management, but the patient, intuitive work of helping damaged horses become whole again. He'd moved into the house Morrison had promised, a comfortable 3-bedroom place with a small barn and paddock where he could work with special cases after regular ranch hours. Phoenix lived there with him, along with 2 other horses he was rehabilitating, and the property had become his sanctuary, the place where broken animals came to heal and where Jake continued to heal himself. He'd paid off his remaining debts, started a modest savings account, and even begun looking at property he might eventually purchase. Not to recreate his father's ranch, but to build something new, something that reflected his own vision and purpose. The workshop concluded to genuine applause, and Jake dismounted, accepting congratulations from attendees with a humility that felt natural rather than performative. He'd learned that success wasn't about proving others wrong, though there was admittedly satisfaction in that. It was about proving yourself right, trusting your instincts even when everyone else questioned them, believing in potential that others couldn't see. Tom Brennan approached as the crowd dispersed, his expression sheepish and his usual swagger notably absent. "That was impressive, Hollister," he said, extending his hand. "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you and that horse, wrong in ways I'm not proud of." Jake shook his hand, feeling no vindication or spite, just a quiet satisfaction that came from having nothing left to prove. "We all make mistakes in judgment, Tom. The important thing is learning from them." Brennan nodded, clearly relieved that Jake wasn't going to make this more difficult than it needed to be. "I've got a mare that injured herself last month. Veterinarian says she might not recover full soundness. Would you be willing to take a look at her?" The request represented complete reversal from the mockery Brennan had shown 6 months ago, and Jake recognized it as the closest thing to contrition the man was capable of. "Call the ranch office tomorrow. We'll set up an evaluation." After Brennan left, Jake led Phoenix back toward his trailer, pausing when he saw a familiar figure waiting by the fence. Katie Henderson looked different than she had during her tearful visit months ago. There was strength in her posture now, confidence in her expression. She smiled when she saw him, and Jake felt genuine warmth at her presence. "I heard you were giving a workshop," she said. "Had to come see how you 2 were doing." They talked for 30 minutes, Katie filling him in on her life. She'd graduated college and taken a job with an equine therapy program, working with rescued horses and troubled youth, finding her own purpose in the healing power of human-animal connection. "Watching what you did with Phoenix changed something in me," Katie admitted. "Made me realize I didn't have to follow my father's path, didn't have to see horses as purely economic assets."